Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Cleland. I'm a PhD candidate at UNC Chapel Hill and a member of the NC Breathe Planning Committee. And today I have the honor of introducing the 3 student research poster presentations. So I was a part of the poster judging committee. We received a ton of great posters this year, and we were responsible for selecting 3 for a brief talk here. But before I introduce our speakers, I wanted to quickly mention that all of the posters are up and around the room, and we highly encourage you during a break, when you have a second, to go look at the posters, connect with the students if you can. There's a lot of great work covering a wide range of important topics, from low-cost air pollution monitoring to green space to decentralized sanitation. So again, when you have a break, definitely go look at the posters because there's a lot. But now on to our speakers. Today we're going to be having 3 presentations. The first 2 will be remote. So first we'll hear from Sophia Ryan from Appalachian State. Next we'll hear from Cassine Mehdi from Syracuse University. And last but certainly not least, we'll be hearing from Lindsay Savelli and Amy Kristen from UNC Chapel Hill. So Sophia, if you want to go ahead.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. There it goes. Today, I'm going to be presenting on my research looking at the relationship between green space and mental health in both rural and urban neighborhoods in North Carolina. So starting off, I wanted to share my initial research questions. My first question was, does green space benefit mental health in North Carolina, specifically at the zip code level? And the reason I asked this question is because in the literature, there's quite a lot of studies that have found that green space does benefit mental health, but there are also multiple that have found there's no association. So I wanted to start off by seeing if we find this positive mental health relationship with green space here in North Carolina. And then my second question was, do rurality, rural versus urban neighborhoods, and type of green space, in this case, public green space versus private green space, influence this relationship? So I began by identifying my green spaces. And like I said, I had 2 different definitions. The first was public green space, which I defined as free and openly accessible to the public. And I used the Protected Area Database of the United States and the Trust for Public Land ParkServe data to identify these green spaces. And as you can see in the top map, there's quite a bit of public green space in North Carolina. And the western part of the state and the eastern part of the state have more when I use this definition. And then private green space I defined as vegetated land cover that was not included in that public green space definition. And in that second map, the one on the bottom, we can see that private green space is evenly distributed throughout the state. And there's substantially more private green space than there is public green space. I defined rurality using the rural urban commuting area codes. And I set rurality and urbanity as a binary. So zip codes were either classified as rural or urban. And what you can see from this map here is that there are zip codes that are considered urban and rural located throughout the state. For my mental health outcomes, I looked at anxiety, depression, mental illness, mood disorders, self-harm and suicide ideation, substance abuse, and suicide. All of my mental health outcomes, except for suicide, come from NC Detect, which is emergency department data, and my suicide data is mortality data from the North Carolina Violent Death Reporting System. And what my results showed is that green space does benefit mental health in North Carolina. What this figure here is showing is the coefficients I got from my regression analysis. And as you can see, all the coefficients are negative, which tell us that per unit increase in green space per person, we see a decrease in mental health outcomes. And I really want to highlight private green space in urban areas, which I found to be the strongest relationship. And then public green space in rural areas, which while still showing a positive relationship there of green space benefiting mental health, was the weakest relationship. Diving a little deeper into these regression results, like I mentioned those coefficients before, we see those in the top 2 rows of each of the tables here. But what I'm really going to highlight on this slide is those R-squared values. What the R-squared tells us is the variability that our independent variable, in this case green space, explains of our dependent variable. So, for example, suicide ideation and self-harm, the quantity of private green space per person in urban areas explains almost 18% of the variability we see in suicide ideation and self-harm cases in North Carolina. And the other one I wanted to highlight was suicide, where we see that, once again, private green space in urban areas explains over 16% of the variability we see in suicide. In rural areas, explanatory um, the explanatory power of green space is slightly less. We see that for substance abuse, private green space in rural areas explains about 14% of the variability we see in substance abuse emergency department cases. And then here, again, I wanted to highlight suicide, where even though this is a less strong relationship, we're still seeing that the amount of private green space per person in rural areas explains almost 11% of the variability we see in suicide. My conclusions from this initial research are that green space does benefit mental health in North Carolina. We see that private green space had a stronger relationship with mental health outcomes, and that was true in both rural and urban areas. And we saw that overall, the green space mental health relationship is stronger in urban areas than in rural areas in North Carolina. Moving forward with this research, I would like to consider some additional variables, such as community level variables like economic disparity, structural racism, some individual level variables like age, race, and ethnicity and gender identity, and then additional green space level variables like green space quality and accessibility. Thank you very much.
Oh, is this on? Thank you, Sophia. We'll save all questions for the end if we have time. So next up, we're going to be hearing from Kasim from Syracuse University.
Thank you for having me here. I'm going to present this paper, Modeling Changes in Atmospheric Emissions and Health Outcomes under US Policies to Decarbonize the Electric Grid. This paper is co-authored by scholars from Syracuse University and Georgia Tech. Just a brief overview, as you all must be aware, power plant emissions call all sorts of nasty emissions. These are carbon dioxide, SOx, NOx, PM, and ozone. And in turn, these pollutants have health effects and also ecosystem effects in our communities. The research approach that we follow is that we have 12 decarbonizing policy scenarios. These are cap and trade, carbon tax, clean energy standard, and renewable portfolio standards. And we use assumptions of each one of these policy scenarios and input it in IPM integrated planning model, which is extensively used by EPA. And from IPM, we get emissions, energy mix, and costs for each one of these policies. We use the IPM output and put it in CMAQ, which models the change in air quality for PM and ozone on a 36 by 36 kilometer grid. And then we use the change in air quality and put it into BenMap, which is another platform used extensively by EPA to understand what sort of health effects it will have in our communities. These are the 12 cases that we run in our paper. I'm not going to go over what these are due to shortage of time, but I'm going to touch upon this one in particular, CS40B. It's a clean energy standard, and I'm going to talk about it here because Biden administration was interested in implementing a CES, clean energy standard, but the political viability of a clean energy standard right now hangs in question, but it's something that was of interest in current political times. So this is the IPM output, and the top two generation mixes are for US, the down one are for North Carolina. And if we have a business as usual, or if we do nothing, the US generation mix sort of looks constant. You have a lot of gas, you have a lot of coal, and you have a lot of nuclear, but nothing changes a lot. And when you implement a clean energy standard, coal, this red piece here, it quickly sort of goes out of the energy generation mix. Next is gas, and it takes time, but over a passage of 30 years, it sort of goes down. Wind expands considerably over time, and solar up here, this brown area, also expands over time. For North Carolina in particular, in 2020, well, the generation mix sort of is constant again. There is nuclear, there is coal, there is gas, and there is solar. Now, the axes are a little different. This is 115 terawatt hour, and this is 300 terawatts hour. But we see a similar pattern between the US generation mix and the North Carolina generation mix. Coal steadily goes away by 2030. Gas is also going away by 2050. But the most interesting part is that solar expands considerably, and we project that North Carolina becomes exporter of solar energy. And there is some base load of nuclear energy which remains there. So we use this IPM data of generation mixes, and we use CMAC to plot how our ambient air quality for ozone and PM is going to change. Most of the reductions actually occur in Ohio Valley and Midwest. For ozone in particular, the results are a little bit more dispersed. In southern US and Texas, there are some reductions observed as well. And then we use that air quality data and model how the health effects are going to be. For US, we see that in the counties which are urban, we have immense health benefits. Premature deaths averted in 2015 are almost 17,000. And over a passage of 30 years, these are almost 265,000. And these are concentrated in urban areas. As I said, the top places where there are premature deaths averted are highest are in Chicago, Houston, Dallas, Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, New York City. And most of these are, again, concentrated in the eastern part of US. Western US doesn't have a lot of changes happening there. For North Carolina in particular, in 2050, almost 881 premature deaths are averted. And over a passage of 30 years, if we decarbonize the electric grid, almost 13,500 premature deaths are averted. And the benefits are largest in Charlotte, Winston-Salem, Greensboro, and Asheville. And we estimate from IPM that the cost of high ambition policy cases, including CS40B, is actually 15 to 18% higher than the baseline cost, which is not a lot of cost. And in the passage of 30 years, we would end up reducing almost more than 30 gigatons of CO2 emissions, which is just huge. In summary, key takeaways for North Carolina: solar expands considerably in IPM. Coal goes away to zero both for North Carolina and US by 2030. Policies considered in our analysis have immense health benefits that far exceed the cost. And nationally, we believe that the model predicts that we can achieve zero carbon emissions by 2040, only at a cost which is 15 or 18% higher than the baseline. Thank you so much for having me here.
Okay, great, thank you. And last but not least, we'll have Amy and Lindsay from UNC Chapel Hill. And I think...
Does this work? Does this work? Great. All right. Hi, I'm Amy, and this is my colleague Lindsay. And first, we just want to thank everyone so much for being here and presenting us with this opportunity to share more about our work with Anderson community. And of course, first, we want to also call out the support from our faculty mentor, who you heard from earlier today, Dr. Woods, who is the director of the Environmental Justice Action Research Clinic at UNC Chapel Hill. So thank you very much. And also our incredible community partners in the Anderson community themselves, including especially the Reverend Brian Schaffner and Miss Anita Faust. Scroll down, please. Thank you. The Anderson community is located in Caswell County, as you can see on this map here, and it has been selected as the proposed site of an asphalt plant. There are multiple residence homes that are within 1/4 mile of this proposed plant. We also want to talk a little bit about briefly the demographics of the Anderson community. 83% of residents identify as African American, Latin, or American Indian. And that paired with the fact that the community is already experiencing nuisances, including those related to a local animal shelter, make this proposed asphalt plant a case of environmental racism and a potential environmental injustice. However, there are multiple assets and advocacy already happening within the community, and the Anderson Community Group, pictured here, has been mobilizing for multiple years to fight this proposed plant.
And so here on this slide is a picture of an asphalt plant, and everything highlighted in orange is a potential source of emissions. And we know that asphalt plants, based off of existing studies, produce or emit harmful toxins and chemicals. These include particulate matter, arsenic, and benzene, which is a known carcinogen. And current studies have really only focused on occupational exposure to these hazards and less on residential exposure to asphalt plant pollution and pollutants. And so what we do know is that these pollutants are linked to a variety of negative health outcomes that attack various systems throughout the body and result in various forms of cancer, neurological issues, respiratory issues, and can even impact fetal and infant health. And so in response to this proposed site, community residents conducted an unofficial survey and found that government documentation actually misrepresented the demographic makeup of the community, as well as environmental concerns and community residents' concerns about the community. And so this is where we formed a partnership with the Anderson Community Group, with UNC and the NCIPH, to conduct a community health assessment. And so we used phone-based and in-person surveys that were conducted alongside community leaders to help build trust and rapport with outside researchers. And we surveyed homes within a 1-mile radius of the proposed site. And throughout this research approach, we've used a community-based participatory research approach, which equitably includes community partners in each step of the research process.
Through this assessment, we were able to survey 48 households within the Anderson community, again within that 1-mile radius, and we found that 77% of Anderson residents reported being formally diagnosed with at least one chronic illness. 48% of Anderson residents reported 3 or more formally diagnosed chronic illnesses, and finally 45% of Anderson residents reported at least one disability that limits life activities. We also then compared the prevalence of multiple health issues and disabilities in Anderson community and compared them with the North Carolina average. And as you can see here, the prevalence is much higher within the Anderson community for these four health issues listed. So there was 3.1 times the prevalence of asthma in the Anderson community, 4.4 times the amount of lung disease in the Anderson community, nearly twice as much diabetes in the Anderson community, and again, nearly twice as much high blood pressure reported in the Anderson community. And all of these health issues and disabilities really have a cumulative impact on a number of other disparities that we see within Caswell County when compared to North Carolina. So there are much fewer, 6.2 times fewer physicians in Caswell County compared with the North Carolina average. Additionally, residents reported multiple environmental health problems, including 60% of residents reporting plumes of smoke and 62% of residents reporting strange odors from their households.
And so thinking broadly about cumulative impacts as well as other compounding stressors in the community in relation to the asphalt plant, residents have also voiced concerns about decreased property values and increased truck traffic, which will further compound the nuisances from this local animal center. They're also worried about recent tree clearing that has gone on in their community, as well as tactics that have been used by the asphalt plant to stifle community participation, including a SLAP lawsuit that was filed against 58 residents. And so we just wanted to share the voice of one community resident who says, quote, "Our health is more important than a polluting industry. Why add another stressor to the list? Let the people breathe freely. Do not give them a license to kill." And so this study just reinforces the fact that we need policies to protect the Anderson community and similar communities from environmental racism. We also need to consider cumulative impacts in the permitting process and protect community residents from baseless lawsuits. And so if this issue speaks to you, you can take action today by donating and supporting communities who are fighting against polluting industries and asphalt plants. You can join EJ networks like the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network, contact your state representatives, reach out to friends and family and share these issues with them, and follow EJ organizations, their listservs and media. And while we talk about actions that y'all can take, we did just want to take a moment to highlight the actions that the Anderson residents and the Anderson Community Group have taken since 2019 to fight against this plant. And most recently, the asphalt plant has received the permits they need to operate within the community, and the community is now responding with an EPA complaint. And so we do just want to take a moment as well to recognize the help of other UNC students, community residents, and NCIPH staff for their support with this survey as well. And thank you all for your time and inviting us to be here today.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. If people, I think there's microphones here, or if there's any questions online. If anyone has questions for any of the student presenters.
To the UNC students, thank you for the presentation from Caswell County. Can you talk a little bit more about the cumulative impacts in the community and the concerns from the community about those cumulative impacts and the understanding too in the community of what that really is?
Thank you for your question. I don't know if this works. Can y'all hear me okay? Yeah. So we've been thinking a lot about looking at cumulative impacts with a broader lens from just looking at chemical stressors, but also thinking about, this is a situation of environmental racism. The community's experienced discrimination. They've experienced other types of stressors. We're thinking about property values, the stress that brings on folks who have saved for 35 years to buy out their homes, who now aren't able to sell them, and the economic stress that puts on them as well if they try to leave the community. We've talked about the truck traffic as well and what that means to children and their health and their ability to even play in their community and enjoy the well-being or the green spaces that we heard about earlier, being able to play in their community. And so I think the ways that we've sometimes traditionally thought about cumulative impacts, we're trying to expand that scope a little bit within this community because this issue targets so many other aspects of people's well-being aside from just the chemical pollutants that are very important but are just one part of this issue.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question.
Good morning. Thank you for your presentation as well. Quick question. Have there been any efforts to advocate to the local officials to not have that facility located there? And if so, what were their responses, if you have it?
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer this question, but I think residents have tried to voice their concerns to public officials, and I think some public officials were even voted in who were supposed to kind of support the community's, what the community wanted, and that hasn't really followed through. And so I think that's been one area of frustration. I don't want to speak on behalf of any residents. But I do know there have been multiple ways that folks have tried to organize around this issue. There's been a lot of communication with the local Caswell County officers as well, or representatives, even in terms of like zoning ordinances as well, and seeing what the zoning permits are like in this community and trying to have local ordinances in place to try to protect these communities. And unfortunately, that just hasn't come through at the moment. So it's one avenue that we're working with as well. Thank you for your question.
Yeah, hi, Dan Costa. Last question maybe. I thought all of the abstracts were really great. I had an opportunity to read them all, and I compliment the speakers today. I have a question for Sophia, and she may have touched on this. Certainly in their conclusions indicated or suggested that private green space had a greater impact than public. And you talked about future work. Do you think that's an economic component to that? Because the whole effort to push for green space in communities and community redevelopment is so important. If it's private, I'm not sure how all that works together.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I was surprised by that result. I thought from the literature I read that we'd see a stronger relationship with public green spaces. And I think part of it is likely due to my green space definitions in that I'm underestimating available public green space and therefore overestimating private green space. And I think your point about economic status is really important. And there's been a lot of literature in that area as well, that like upper class communities tend to have more green space, both public and private. And that's one of the factors I want to look at moving forward. So potentially reevaluating my green space definitions to make sure I'm properly capturing public versus private, and then also including the economics, like additional community level factors like neighborhood economic status, to see how that kind of moderates the relationship.
Okay, great. Thanks again to all of our student presenters. I think we're going to go into a short break, and we highly encourage you to look at all of the posters around the room and connect with the students here, and maybe see if you can get the contact information for the students online, because we'd love to open a conversation with all of these great student research presentations.